too long, but I'm hopefully going to provoke some thought in your mind around where this can go to in terms of machine learning, deep learning, all those exciting AI concepts that are at play, and how they're going to affect the current development world that we live in and that we operate in. And hopefully it doesn't take our world away. Because I'll start off with that picture because it reminded me way back when I was at school. I had a biology project that I promised that I would do a setup of a brain and I would get the whole thing in place. I went to the abattoir and I arranged everything. And the guy gave me this brain and it was this lump jelly on the plate. And I said, no, this doesn't work for me. I need something better than that. So he said, look, every time we take the brain out, it's going to collapse. You've got to do something about it. So it progressed from there to actually literally having a sheep's head cut off at the top. So I forgive those that are vegetarians, and I know all of you that eat lamb, so don't look at me in judgment like that. But we basically, I got this lamb, kept it in the deep freeze, and then I cut its head off. It was actually a fully grown sheep, so I didn't kill any lambs, just in case anybody's wondering. And I injected formalin into this. I put a whole formalin in play, and I extracted this brain out of this poor lamb's head. The thing that came of it was ultimately sometimes the task that you think you're going to engage looks easy, but it can get a little messy at times. And when you have those big blue eyes stare back at you once you've removed the skin, there's some nightmares that follow as well. So hopefully that doesn't become what this technology is all about for us. I just did a quick summary, my own whirlpool of what I think we've gone through in terms of software development and the exposure that I've had the opportunity to be part of since a very long time ago. I'm not going to give you a reference. But basically, what we've dealt with over time, so that's whirling from the top, coming down to the bottom, is I was really involved a lot in the, is that better? Sorry, can everybody hear me a bit better there? Okay. Involved in the explosion of client server and the end of mainframe. The mainframe was going to die and the client server was just taking over, and that was going to be the future of everything related to development. We all know that that wasn't true, but it became the reality of what drove basically a revolution that ultimately picked up more speed and wind with the web interface and the internet that came about and various other areas that spun out, the API aspects of connecting within an organization. And I think we also see that now extending a lot further to the API economy. So a lot of these things are building on what was already there. So there's a little bit of the past, brings us a little bit of the future as well. But I think there's been a significant explosion, especially in the data space. We all know that data is nearly everywhere, and what are we saying in the last year? We generated more data than we've generated in the last however long, I think since man began. So the key thing with this is that we're dealing in a different world, and it's becoming a lot more complicated in that sense. But how do we engage as a developer community? What are we going to be doing to keep up with this? And we've embarked on a process of looking at elements of the AI space and machine learning. And I've got to tell you, I feel like time is warping and collapsing on us. We're trying to accomplish so much in so little time. And some of these ideas, we're having to jump in and grab research papers that are hot off the press. You read it, you engage with a lot of the academic guys, and they're saying they don't even get the chance sometimes to write the paper when some of their ideas are already in question. So I think that gives you the sense of the kind of significant amount of change we're having to embrace and deal with in terms of where we're at right now. And I think the other part is that large organizations are sometimes dragging the skill base in the global scale. If you look at the large players in the States, they're taking in all the talent. You've also now started with the AlphaGo project, and I'm sure everybody, I saw earlier on they were watching the rocket thing. I gladly watched the SpaceX project. I thought it was quite exciting, but I don't know if anybody's watched that show on the AlphaGo project. For me, the most intimidating element of it was how human beings responded to the reality of their defeat in that context, and then turning around to say, wait a minute, there's actually some sort of opportunity going on here. There's some sort of change. There's something fresh to be learned. And for me, as much as the AI talks about the end of mankind, I see it as very much an alongside, an opportunity for it to progress with us and help us do the things that we do better. Okay, then as I mentioned to you, I started with that brain story. It stuck with me over the years because I've got to tell you one other story about the brain. In all the papers, when I'd done that whole project, I had to write up a file of everything that I could research as much as I could from the available text. And let me tell you, I want to tell you that file was probably about this thick. And I like précis, I like paragraphs, I don't like essays. And I can probably tell you that most of what I wrote in that thing is no longer relevant. So it spoke about the fact that neurons are created and are then once destroyed, never recreated. Little did anybody know about the stem cells that are in play in people's lives right now. That wasn't there when I dealt with that project. You talk of the mind, once an area is destroyed, there's nothing else you can do. You talk about brain plasticity, is the concepts that are emerging, and we find ourselves soaked in those new ideas and new thinking. And then you look at the research that's being done in brain research right now, that I would scared to be able to even guess at to what they're going to discover and how rich it's going to be. And I think the same thing would be said in terms of the technology that go with it. But this fascination of what we're actually dealing with comes down to, I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read this book, Fast and Slow? If you haven't, I would really recommend getting the audiobook, not reading it, because his style is a little bit, it can drive you a bit crazy. But what he basically talks about in this book is the fundamental of how we engage and our minds engage with the world around us. And what he picks up is that we would think the fast side would be the rational, but it's not. It's actually the slow side of our thinking. So we engage, and we logically break it down, and we divide it. Like if I had to say to you all this morning, walk me through the experience of your brushing your teeth this morning, or the actions that you took in driving your car to get here. Those kind of actions are not in that rational, carefully thought through. Those are the places we go to when we're solving problems. And the reality is a fair chunk of our IT engagement, we go over to this rational space and this rational side of things. So we stop and we carefully think about the functionality, think about the logical implementation, but very seldom do we necessarily project over to the other side. And the other side speaks about it's a fast response. It's our brain's response to the world, what we instinctively do. And I think there's an element in that of both the instinctive nature, but also the intuition. And this is the part that I want to expand on, that I'm saying is going to cause us fundamentally to have to include what we're getting up to into what we're working on a day-to-day basis on the development side. That intuitive response that we as human beings know. So we talk about AI and we talk about intelligence, but do we stop and understand how we are actually working? And we get very intimidated by the movies and the mind frame sets that have been set up for us to basically follow. And I want to talk to that concept there of the intuitive element. What he basically, in the book, covered as the author was the principle of this dual process that we have system 1 and system 2 responses that we engage with. And the one that I want to talk to is really the fast side, because there's an intuition and an element that breaks down how our brains behave. And there's also with it certain biases. So we think we're making the right choice. And what was interesting in the concept that he describes there is that the fact that you are thinking and responding quickly, but I can be trained in statistics and know every facet of inference and all the clever elements of what a statistical pattern might do. But as a human being, in the context of my bias, my response to certain environmental issues, I do anything but the statistical outcome. So now if you go and look at a lot of the machine learning techniques that we start with in basis, a lot of it is in statistical inference. So there's methods that are picking up and determining those, and it has its place. But there's also this other side, and the other side is what I want to really unpack a little bit more in going through what we covered today. But there's a reality of dealing with the point that there's a bias, that there's points of instinctive response that aren't always right. What also makes me, if you feel like I'm losing you a bit, there's a brilliant, I don't know if anybody knows about Ramanujan, the mathematician of the start of the 1920s. He got the very limited time to engage with the guys in Cambridge, and he had a technique where he would just literally know the answer to some of these concepts and ideas in infinite series. And he would just write down, the guy calls him to the board in the movie as a classic example of it, and he just writes down the answer. And that's how he was seeing it. And when they asked him to unpack, he says, I can't tell you. And he rigorously tries through and lots of suffering to try and work out the steps, but he can't get it. He intuitively has it. Now that is a strength to our thinking. Because that same thing in what's mentioned in one of the books, Blink, is the same concept. When you walk into a doctor that's got 50 years or 30 years experience, and he looks at you, and in the first 2 minutes, he's worked out what is in theory wrong with you. You could ask, is that just magic? What is that? And that is our brain, the intuitive response of that person's brain to the circumstance. But it doesn't just happen. And I think that's the part that I want to just have a look at. Because basically the inference there, as I've got at the bottom there, in prediction, is made by intuition, is extremely difficult to explain. And that to this day, this lies, because I don't know how you guys have found, keeping up with the material on AI and the machine learning stuff, sometimes your head spins. I don't know if you guys feel that. I'm reading the stuff and I'm thinking, okay, have I got it? Don't I have it? Then I have some fundamental questions. I think maybe I'm just stupid, so I shouldn't ask that question. And the reality is, in a fair chunk of these things, they don't know. So what we've done in this concept in deep learning is we've shot ahead in a technique before we really understood it. And if you think where computer science and all the other sciences come from, it comes from a deep-seated mathematics that understood and could calculate and formulate. And then we discovered formula, like Ramanujan did, and 100 years later, there's some application to deep black holes that they were able to use certain of his formulas. This is not what's going on in this deep learning space. Is that it's basically discovering an intuition to which we cannot explain, but we know it works. And we've got the recipe. So we know how to cook it up, and we get a result. But the issue, the challenge is important to, whoops, what's going on there? That's not good. Norton, the virus of all viruses, eh? Okay. So there's just a summation, few points on intuition. So on the far side, we know it's a massively parallel process. We also know that it appears to be reductive, but it's definitely not. And that it also does not involve filtering. Now, if you look at a lot of the techniques in coding, et cetera, right now, in finding certain pieces of information, that's what they tell you around on the AI space. A lot of it has been around the basis of trying to work out a reductive technique. If we can break it down small enough, we can figure out how it works. And then they make this leap, and they tell you that the neuron in neural networks is the same as the neuron. It's not. So don't kid yourself. We're still understanding how our neuron works. But the fact is we have something that works in a way, and it's giving us a result. And I think that's the important aspect. So it appears quickly in the consciousness. There's things that will come to your mind that defies time. How did it get there? How did I know that? But yet I know there is an element to it. Understanding the reasons for the full comprehension, you have no awareness of it. There's things that you know. You walked up and you said, how do I know this one thing? That doctor that just knows this particular patient is in a fatal condition and there's no symptoms that are necessarily indicating that. And it is also important that in our brains, it's a response to which we feel an urge to act. And it speaks to that flight or fight side, but also sometimes in responding. So how does our brain improve its intuition? It basically gains knowledge. And then through experience, it keeps on learning and it improves in that process. So that you can see the parallel there in terms of the deep learning. So what does deep learning have to do? Now, for those that on the little bit more on the machine learning side, is everybody familiar with supervised, unsupervised learning? Do I need to quickly go into show of hands? Good. I don't need to explain it. Must I quickly explain it? Okay. So unsupervised learning is effectively you're working with a set of data and you're trying to get groupings, you're trying to get an understanding, but there's no definitive outcome. So it's like I've got a function, but I've got a function of X, but I've got no definitive Y. So you're trying to find groupings, you're trying to find patterns. And there's lots of nice techniques, and definitely in certain of the term slips me right now, but in certain of the neural networks that basically reflect back on themselves, you're able to get nice reduction outcomes in terms of those. But effectively on the, oh, forgive me, my mind's just had a slip. Yes. So on the supervised learning side, effectively what you're doing there is you've got a definitive outcome. So you've got F, you've got your function, and you've got your Y outcome. And if I get enough of those, I can train. And if you look at all the deep learning breakthrough, that's exactly what the guys have done. So when you guys all went and played on some of those apps, and I also gladly played, and we categorized whether there was a dog, there was a cat, you remember all those ones? We were feeding that data into the learning process. And effectively that learning requires that, and that is supervised learning, it requires a definitive outcome to which you can learn. And deep learning is still in that space. It hasn't gone beyond. There's certain techniques, but there's nothing going beyond that right now. So what does that do to the nature of the kind of learning that you can get up to? Well, it basically does limit it. It makes it pretty narrow. So the threat, and I saw got an article from one of our customers, or a request from one of our customers that had in the front, artificial general intelligence. I thought, oh, this is already trouble. Because there's just no way we're near that at this point in the game. But I want to tell you there's a scary reality, because from the AlphaGo project that I mentioned to you, the South Koreans are pouring billions in. The Chinese are pouring billions in, and the Japanese are pouring billions in. There's a significant waste up from the Eastern Hemisphere that, wait a minute, we've been caught out. There's an idea, there's things going on that we need to be part of, and they are pouring money in. And in the States, and I'm going to put up a slide, Mr. Trump is there, which you saw in some of the other sessions, and he's not worrying about that right now. And all these corporates are having to spend or spending, and they're holding it on a proprietary basis. And some of them are open and sharing it. And the question is why they're open and sharing it, because for me, there is an element of the value of open source in that we collectively share, but ultimately these organizations have to get penetration of the ideas. They're also trying to dominate. And what's the best domination strategy than to all be using the only book or play, and that's their set of plays. So there's a competition unfolding. And so don't kid yourself, everybody's being generous and we want to give away things for nothing. There's always a game at play. And I think that's the part. So what is, in looking at that right-hand side, there's a whole collection of bias that kick in. And that's the part. And I'm not going to walk through all of these. You're more than welcome to go under the heading, go and Google it. You'll find it in Wikipedia. And you can literally go through. And I know in the book, the Fast and Slow book, he effectively covers a fair chunk of those. But the ones that are summarized that I want to just touch on is the core of what do these get up to. So key element of the whole cluster on the one side is what should we be remembering? Because that's effectively one of those biases. We have a limited memory. We don't have an indefinite memory. So until somebody takes Mr. Hawkins' suggestion that we start actively going and building interfaces into our brains, I don't think we're going to get that part sorted out too quickly. The other side is too much information. We're overwhelmed. And the reality is, what has computers done for us up to this point? They've built a tremendous amount of processing way beyond what we can capable of and comprehend in the remotest nature of what we're capable of computing. So those are our physical limitations. But then there's also an element of it needs to act fast, okay? And that's the speed aspect that I spoke about. That, as I say, they don't yet understand what's bringing about that intuitive response that we in our brains, they know it's definitively a parallel process, but there's no quantifiable elements of understanding of how that's working. And then the key thing is meaning. And a lot of the times we will drive meaning into whatever we don't understand. And I think that's our human condition. So when we look at a set of it can't be this, and we pursue that meaning. And I think that sometimes is a bias because sometimes it's not, there's nothing to pursue. There is just nothing more than what is being presented. Some of it can get a bit cynical, but I think the key aspect there is being able to test that meaning. And going back to fundamentals. I'm not going to go on too long about that. But let me just talk about the principle, though, in terms of where you're dealing now with an environment. So we're dealing a lot with the rational side, and now we're talking about the intuitive side of the brain, which is, there is an element, you saw the violin, there's music, there's creativity. So I'm saying to us as a group, we've got to start untapping some of that side to come up with some of these answers. Because it's not going to be in the rational thought. It can be the rational thought of that side, but it's got to be in understanding where those gaps are. Because ultimately, we build technology in the custom development space because we enjoy it. There is a fun element. But there's also a reality that we build systems to make enterprises better, to make individuals better, to change the nature of life. So we've got to start to ask that question backwards. Who's going to be using what we're doing, and how's it going to change their world? That's the heart of custom development. And if I had the golden wand or stick for that to tell you what the answer was, I don't think I'd be standing here. But I think that's the part you have to start to unlock and question. And what's key around what we did in those creative days, just quickly writing, quickly hacking stuff together, is that there was design. There was design thinking in it. And those designs had patterns. We were able to, in open source, curate and communicate effectively. So it's a wider audience. And the same thinking has to go into this space of where we are with deep learning. So I'm sure, has everybody recently seen that article that Alibaba's got that neural net that's busy reading Wikipedia? Has anybody tried anything like that yet? Are we going to be brave and try it? I don't know whether it's going to be Wikipedia, but the point is, some of these things you've got to try. Because if you're going to wait for the paper and wait for the explanation of how to do it, it's not going to happen. It speaks to the speed part. There's an element of just taking a dive and trying some of these things. And I think that's the part. Hopefully, if I don't leave you with anything, I'll leave you with that, is to provoke you to start looking at these kind of problems and the kind of areas of application in a new and a different way. Okay, obviously the codification makes it tacit. You know what's interesting about our brain is we will digest multiple concepts and ideas, and then we compress it down to verbally do what I'm doing to you right now and try and communicate a concept that paints a picture in your mind. This is probably one of the most inefficient ways of communicating. Does everybody realize that? I mean, I think our phones are talking to each other faster than we are able to speak to each other in a computing rate. But the interesting idea is when we do that, in that process of unpacking it, we are able to almost communicate a model to which you can visualize in your head. And I think there's an element there, there's an excitement there in looking at problems from that kind of perspective. Okay, and I think the key thing that's always in play here, who in their life has not copied and pasted in their coding? Okay, good, nobody lies here. Okay, and I think, so the next step in delving into this space is get the examples and play with them. And I think we know some of these, but it's an element of in delving, because innovation, if you go and look, and I found somebody that's got a nice paper that statistically proves that most innovation is just a step to the side of something that's already there. And just a step over from that is actually quite deep innovation. That's what I'm trying to indicate at the bottom. So once you've got the patterns, you've got the idea down, try the pattern, and then look for the innovation next to that, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. Because it's the inclination of where do I start? And sometimes just start on something. And I think that's the challenge that I've personally had to face in the last 2 years of us working on some of these kind of initiatives, has been the ability to just take a step. Because you procrastinate, you want to understand, you want to apply that rational side. And sometimes it's just around doing it and then seeing what you get. Sorry, I should have got the remote clicker. Okay, so this wasn't a stereotype, by the way. Could have had guys in designer outfits there and girls with the cars, but I just thought it highlights the part. That design in itself is actually quite irrational. So tell me why somebody that would like that swimming costume and somebody would like that particular car. There's no rationality in it, and yet we're trying from an IT and a development point of view, implement rational reason why people should consume it. They've been trying for decades now to rationalize AI, and it doesn't rationalize in certain contexts. And I think that's the key idea. So where does the opportunity lie? The opportunity lies in understanding your customer's context. This goes back to some fundamentals, understanding their context, and then mapping your product or your service in alignment with that. But it's how it fits. And in the fit is the value that you're offering the customer. And I think that's the trick. The trick is in that ability to be able to genuinely understand the customer's perspectives from the point of view of it being intuitive and not necessarily in the rational conclusion. Okay, so where are we then naturally stupid on those sides of biases? So the 4 main biases that I pulled out basically says we have a lack of memory. I did my own little hash code thing that I don't know what it means in brackets, but I thought I'd leave you a symbol, you'll remember it. As technologists, we can remember symbols, we don't necessarily remember words. Okay, there's a lack of memory, there's an inability to think fast, the lack of meaning, and too much information. So in the lack of memory, it's in the information and the ability to recall. So it lies predominantly in the core areas of search and relevance. So what does search become? I've seen a number of demos today. It's excellent stuff in terms of visual. There's also the audible, natural language processing. You can list it. That search is opening up and unpacking with all the options. The point is, can we compete with the Googles and the Microsofts and the Amazons of the world to come up with some of the research on that? Is it something we should be building, or is it something we should just be consuming and using? And that's where we conflicted. I remember from a development background, can we just run it ourselves? Do we have to use somebody else's stuff? And that relinquishing that element or starting to actually use that is going to become vital to making any inroads in the space. Okay, and then obviously the inability to think fast, and that's the time, with less time. And the ability there is to explore. And what's coming out of these deep learning models is as they've trained it on masses of cats, I'm sure everybody knows about that, eh? They use the pictures of all the cats in YouTube to basically get some image processing and recognition going. I think cat was the first thing recognized. Was basically the idea that once you get these models going, they can actually start to generate. So it starts to become intuitive. It's no longer just coming up with what you gave it. It's actually able to generate it. And that's where AlphaGo and all of those projects went. They started to play games with themselves and started to discover different outcomes. And the one thing that I got out of AlphaGo that was also quite profound is they said, when we play a game, we play to win. When AlphaGo played the game, it played just to win. And it suddenly introduced a set of moves that we as human beings would have rejected totally. And at the end, I'm all shocked by that AlphaGo champion that says, you know what, I'm learning something new. So here was he on the top of his pinnacle, he opens up and he says, this is an intuitive process, there's no way a machine can replicate it. And at the end he says, I've learned something new today. And I thought, my goodness, that we as human beings, we've got to engage that part of our minds in solving some of these problems. And then the ability to autocomplete, I think we all know that, and I hate autocomplete because it doesn't ever think of what I'm thinking on. I have a serious problem with what it says whenever I'm WhatsApping or whatever. Okay. And then the other one, lack of meaning. There's an element where the kind of concepts that need to come into play is the ability to add metadata, to add explanation. We all I felt it the other day. I was reading through articles. I've been given articles by the guys. I'm going through stuff, and I thought, can somebody just summarize this down into half a paragraph so I can read it and get over with it? Because I don't have any more brain power. My brain is tired. I can't read anymore. And that's exactly it. The ability to actually produce that is part of what some of these deep networks are able to do. And being able to tag onto an image, to be able to add context to something that's complicated by putting a few lines of text to explain it. And I think in that also lies the element of prediction. And that's the kind of opportunities we're seeing a lot of, where things would take a while to get there, you can actually predict with the right model now. And what does that do to the way you behave? If I with confidence know that if I go into my pocket, I'm not going to be Mr. Steve Jobs and pull out but I know that there's something in my keys are there. It's intuitive, it's instinctive, I know. And that kind of response in that prediction starts to change the way people engage with technology on a day-to-day basis. And in the last one, too much information, I think you can all figure that one out. It is the element of summarizing, reduced to make decisions, because don't underestimate in the clients and the technologies that we're engaging with in those clients. They're having to make decisions all the time. So we gave them functional consistency. Then we gave them databases and structured data. Then we gave them BI, and they were able to analyze themselves broken, and they asked for a report. And honestly, tell me which customer ever got to the end of they were happy with the report that you produced or the BI summary. Please, can anybody in the room? Yes, you guys are so honest. Because they didn't know what they were looking for. They were trying to make a decision to which they had no understanding of the info that they need. And this space starts to speak to that, starts to speak to those patterns. Remember what I said about deep learning. It requires supervised learning. So you've got to use examples that require the combination where you have the Y values and you can test that. And obviously that certain elements of information is curated and that it's easy to be digested. Okay, so I'm going to end on this. Some food for thought. A couple of quotes that came out all over the place that go and search on some of these things and what these guys are saying and who's rehashing who. There's lots of stuff. But some interesting ones there. You've got a technologist, Elon Musk, with SpaceX, which all have a great affinity to the work that he's doing and the boldness he's going to take. But have you heard some of his points from a business point of view? I know we're not business people, but all of us work in a business at some point or may think of owning a business one day, whatever you might do. He made this statement. He said, the projects that I have pursued, I've never pursued them because I had a certain guarantee of a successful outcome, like a 70, 80%. He said, in actual fact, most of the industries that I pursued, there was less than 5% chance that they would succeed. But I wanted to make a difference. Are you willing to throw your millions after wanting to make a difference? Because that's what this guy's doing and why he's getting the successes he's getting. And then obviously on the Google side, they're talking about the UX side and the user interface. And I think that hints at a little bit of creativity. It hints at a little bit about taking up an art class and drawing it and doing it differently. Because for the years of doing custom development, I've said to the guys, whenever we're writing something, I said to them, there's at least 50 ways of writing this functionality. So you heard the requirement from the customer. There's 50 ways of doing it, but I'm telling you there's only about 2 or 3 usable ways of using it. And that's the anticipation of what us as human beings engaging that technology is involved and about. We can come up with so many technical ways of producing it, but can we come up with intuitive ways? And for the first time, we have a tool set that's with us. Because this is the bit I want to say to you. For many years now, we have been great drivers of technology change into various industries and verticals within the business landscape. But how many have we embraced ourselves? And I think this is the first time. I've always felt like IT has been always a little bit ahead of the rest of the industry. The disruption we've gone through, the change we've gone through, we've always been a little bit ahead. But I think for the first time now in history, we're in face-to-face in the mirror looking and going, there's things we're doing that are not efficient. There's things we're doing, we're wasting time. There's approaches that are just taking far too long. And we have to start partnering with technology. We have to start using it in our day-to-day activities. And there's one up there that I don't know if you can see it as yet. So the last one there about the visualizing, the digital twin, where you can start to create parallels of whatever the person's thinking. I've seen this in engineering space. I see it in a lot of space where they're literally creating with all the IoT, all the Internet of Things. You create basically a model that mimics the real world. That sounds like a movie script that I've just said to you. But the reality is it's there, and people are starting to use those and get different experiences engaging with their customers. But the very last one, there's one there that pops up there. I don't know if I can find it off the top there. Number 2, AI will take over development. It will if we carry on doing a bad job in terms of being slower and not getting to the outcome that the customers require. But I read an interesting article where one guy took three different languages, and they generated, different people that generated RNN networks to actually produce code. The one produced beautiful code in Python, except it didn't compile. But the point is somebody is trying it. And you think there's not going to be an element that it's going to have to embrace this at some point. And the question comes, we write as fallible human beings logical lines of code that I'm reminded on a daily basis are just noughts and ones. And that ultimately have to be perfect. So we're fallible, and we write this stuff, and it has to be perfect. And then people's lives can depend on the other side of it. And now the question is, how do we engage with technology and what we're getting up to and start using some of these AI elements to the way we're working? There's things that could be done in testing. There's things that could be done in so many facets of where we've got the data, we've got the information to be able to work it and apply it on our side. But I want to leave you with that. So hopefully that's not where we find ourselves a year from now. But I think it's an exciting time. I think there's lots going on. There's quotes explain the phenomena of change that's happening around us. And these technologies are there. And I think we're at a point now where we've got to sometimes park our rational thought, abandon it to a little bit of creativity, and see what we might discover in the process. We've had some projects with customers we've gone in, we didn't understand what was going on in the process. They said, give us the data, we'll figure it out in terms of just what the data is speaking to us. And I thought afterwards, it's not such a hard concept, but I found in executive levels in business, it's almost mind-boggling because they don't see it like that. They see the data that we're generating as a log file. And we can analyze and we can look back in the past and we can check, but they also see it as a vindication. That's yesterday, please don't go there. We don't know whether we did it right or wrong. We've got it in case the auditors come in, but we don't actually want to look at anything in there. Does anybody else get that reaction? And the point is, what you've got to do to look for the values, you've got to shift your mindset to say, what is there that I can discover? And we've gone into places where we knew nothing. And then these top engineers come out and say, but how did you know that? How did you know that? How did you know that? And we were using the techniques. And that's what I'm saying to you. I don't want to leave you having spelt out an example and you can go and watch the YouTube video and copy. I'm hopefully going to leave you with an inspiration to try this. Try some elements of it. It's not well defined. There's some consequences we cannot explain. So park that need to have an explanation and be intuitive about it and just dive in and have a go. That's it from me, everybody. Thanks. Are there any questions anybody's got? I haven't delved into detail of the project, but I think sometimes this mind shift has probably been one of my hardest struggles that I've had to deal with in working in this space. Any questions?
Are you worried about sometimes the direction AI and stuff's taking? Or, I think you did touch it that.
Elon Musk's demon mention.
Oh no, I mean I think you mentioned Putin.
Yeah.
Twitter bots.
Do you know what they actually talk about? They talk about the response to Sputnik that America as a nation had is exactly what's going on in certain of the countries, like with Putin, etc. Look at what Putin's doing. Would you argue that Putin's got more usefulness out of Facebook than a fair chunk of the other American companies have got out of it? Okay, that's what I would argue. His application of the technology. We're all worried about the innovation, but his application is quite profound. So are there worries? And I think Elon Musk calls for that, a discipline, a working together to set certain ground rules. You know, I think as human beings, there's unfortunately the reality of the conflict. You read at the end of this, it says, can it make life so much easier? Can it make work so much easier that we're all down to a 15-hour week? Does anybody want that? But then we've got to use AI alongside us. And then we get down, and then it's ask the question, do we even need to be earning money for profit because society will be so sufficient? But what I see in there is the chance of a rebellion. And then I go back to those movies where the technology took over and turned us into batteries and turned us into... So I can't think that far in terms of the implication. But what I do see is it's like everything. It's what those... Recently watching those guys that did the atomic bomb in the Manhattan Project, they realized what they were creating was going to be dangerous. but how could it be deployed? And I think that's the reality with this. There is a danger in what's being discovered, but there's also a reality that it has to start becoming integral to what we're doing. And especially for us as developers. You know, we as human beings, we argue that we love change. We're liars, man. I'm telling you, we're liars. We love changing everybody else's world but our own. That's the bias part there. We don't want to admit that we actually don't want to. And I think this is the part that I want to say to us as developers, that we've got to embrace it. I spoke internally within our organization in the middle of last year, and I said, we've got to, I in my mind, feel intuitively that up to 30% of what we're getting up to in any custom dev has to be AI engaged, has to be of that nature. So I set a quota. Where did I get 30%? I just felt a third of something had to be different. If we didn't do it differently, where were we in any way going to generate something of substance? Does it answer it? I hope.
Do you think that AI will ever produce something truly creative? And I'm including in creativity an elegant piece of code that compiles and does what it's intended to do.
I think I'm going to answer that. I'm going to answer that without going to Facebook or whatever. I want to play you something. Can you hear this? And there's one. Have I got a cable? Ooh, hell. Is the cable going to work? It's new. It's Mr. 10. He doesn't allow you to plug into his systems. It's a little bit of classical stuff. I don't know how many people would enjoy the taste. It's the first AI that's been added to the Composers Society of the World. I don't know what they call themselves. It's pure AI developed, totally AI developed, a whole album of code. You can go and find it. It's on the place, AIVA, AVA. And listen to the stuff they're playing here. Now, I do music on the side thing, and listen. What I can tell you is that when I spoke to you about adjacent and then innovative, most time music is just adjacent. Very few people come up with a sound that's monstrously innovative. So it's an intuitive side, but it's just a step on what we know, what we're familiar with. This thing is killing it.
Okay, because there are only so many bars and so many notes.
But I think it's also that there's an element of, once it got trained, the training aspect of it, it starts to generate its own. And that's the part that I'm seeing more and more of. I mean, I've seen shapes, creative shapes, where they train on the design of certain engineering parts. Then you must see the crazy thing that comes out afterwards. But it adheres to the function of what they wanted. It actually does it. So I think that's the part. And that's what they're saying. Out of that AlphaGo experience was the dynamic that the guy said, I never thought that move was even viable. And he said, now when I see it, there's a creativity. And that's what I was saying in that middle one, where you start to have these things generated. And instead of coming every day and they say, come, generate me 20 ideas. My goodness, my brain on a stick, I feel like that sometimes. But the point is, you actually sit with an AI, you generate, and then you evaluate based on what you know as your contribution with a full brain experience into those solutions, and you put those on the table. So that is how it's got to be part of what we start to get up to. So sorry, it was a little bit futuristic in the sense of where it can go to, but I thought I wanted to end the day with, you've been shown a lot of stuff, but what are you going to do tomorrow? Conferences are always, you feel like you're in a bubble. But what are you going to do tomorrow? What step are you going to take tomorrow? Because some of these things are just literally taking a step and then another step and another step. Okay, any other questions? Sorry. Anybody else? Well, hopefully it's been thought-provoking. Thanks very much, everybody.